Well, stuff that, you know, I come up with ideas, say Cheap as Chimps.
Yeah.
Rockbusters springs to mind.
Yeah.
15
like
Taiwan.
15 Taiwan. Let's just remind people what 15 Taiwan was.
It was a little feature that I wanted to give a run, you know, give it a little run, see if people like it.
The premise being?
No, there's no premise, it's just a title.
No, we were going to get 15 sort of ornaments. You'd explain them.
And perhaps more that he could still do. What I was suggesting to him while he was living with us, because he was 2 levels from homeless by that point, was that he should find a job that he could find, working in a garage, working in a shop, something like that, because he had some mechanical ability, and that he should separate himself from the arrogance that made him presume that such a job would be beneath him, because at that point no job was beneath him. But more importantly, it's not so obvious that jobs are beneath people, you know, because even if imagine you have a job as a checkout person in a grocery store, you know, it's a fairly unskilled job. You can be some miserable, resentful, horrid bastard doing that job, boy. You know, you can come in there just exuding resentment and bitterness and making mistakes and making sure that every customer that passes by you has a slightly worse day than they need to, right? And you know, pilfering time and perhaps pilfering goods and being resentful about the people who gave you the position because they're above you in the dominance hierarchy, and talking, you know, bad things, gossiping behind the back of your co-workers. It's like you can take your menial position, self-described, and turn that into a very nice little slice of hell, that's for sure. And you know, you go into places like that, I always think of the archetypal diner in that way. You know, you guys have been in this diner. There's a really good opposite diner, and there's a great video on YouTube. It's Tom Waits reading a poem by Bukowski, and I think it's called Nirvana, and it's about a good diner that he happened to visit. Bukowski happened to visit when he was on a bus when he was a kid. A diner where everything was going well. You could listen to that, it's great, I think it's great, but this is the opposite diner I'm thinking about. So you'll go into a diner, right, 7 o'clock in the morning, you order some bacon and eggs and some toast, and then you look around in the diner and you think, it was like 1975 when the windows were last washed, and there's this kind of thick coating of who gives a damn grease on the walls, you know, and the floor too has got that sort of stickiness that you really have to work at to develop over years, you know. And the waitress she's not happy to be there, and the guy behind the counter isn't happy that happens to be the waitress that he's working with. And then, you know, you walk down the stairs maybe to the washroom, and that's its own little trip. And so you come back and you order your damn eggs and you order your toast and you order your bacon, and then it comes, and like the eggs are too cooked on the bottom, so they're kind of brown, and then they're kind of raw on top, and they're cold in the middle, which is, you really have to work to cook an egg like that, man. But you can master that with like 10 years of bitterness. You teach you how to cook an egg like that. And then the toast, here's what you do with the toast, right? You take the white bread, you know, the pre-sliced stuff that no one should ever eat, and then you put that in the toaster and you overcook it, and then you wait, and then you pop it out of the toaster, and then because it's overcooked you scrape it off and you knock off the crumbs so it doesn't look too burnt, and then you wait till it's cold, and then you put cold margarine on it, because if you put cold margarine, first of all, not butter, but if you put cold margarine on it, you can also kind of tear holes in it so that then it has lumps of margarine in it, and it's really dry except where it's too greasy. So that's like its own little work of art, man. And then you put that on the side with the eggs, and then you have the potatoes, and this is how you cook the potatoes properly. You know, so they're leftover potatoes, and you keep dumping new leftover potatoes into the old leftover potatoes over weeks, and so some of the potatoes they're no longer potatoes, right? They've half returned to Mother Earth. Then you flap them on the grill, and you sort of, I don't know, you burn them a bit, I guess, and then you slap them on the plate, and Jesus, you don't want to eat those, man. That's for sure, and that's the point. And then you have the bacon, and you want to make sure you buy the lowest possible quality bacon. That's how you start. And then you throw it on the grill, and your grill has to be overheated to do this. You have to cook the bacon so that it's raw in places and burnt in other places, and it has that delightful pig-like odor that only really cheap, badly cooked bacon can provide. Or maybe you use those little breakfast sausages that no one in their bloody right mind would let within 15 feet of anything living, you know. And then you serve that, right? And you serve it with the kind of orange juice that is only orange in color. and with coffee that's, what would you say? It was started too early in the morning. That's the first thing. Bad quality coffee started too early in the morning, got cold once or twice and has been reheated. And then you serve that with whitener. It's like, here's your breakfast. It's like, no, man, that's not breakfast. That's hell. You know? And you created it. And then what you do, if you have a diner like that, is because you have a miserable life if you have a diner like that, and you've really worked on achieving that, is every night you go home and you curse your wife and you curse your kids and you fucking well curse God too for producing a universe where a diner like yours is allowed to exist. And that's your bloody life. So, well, so that's what God's trying to point out here is, if thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted. And if thou doest not well, then sin lies at your door. Well, so I looked at lots of translations for this. Actually, the next line is, and unto thee shall be his desire. Yes. What God actually says is something like this, is like, you know, things aren't going so well for you, but if you were behaving properly, they would. But instead, this is what you've done. Sin came to your door, and sin means to, you know, pull your arrow back and to miss the target. Sin came to your door. But he uses a metaphor, and the metaphor is something like, sin came to your door like this sexually aroused cat, predator thing, and you invited it in first, and then you let it have its way with you. It's like you entered into a creative, he uses a sexual metaphor, you entered into a creative exchange with it and gave birth to something as a consequence, and that what you gave birth to, that's your life. And you knew it. You're self-conscious after all. You knew you were doing this, and you conspired with this thing to produce the situation that you're in. Jung said something about this, similar, about the Oedipal mother situation, which was very politically incorrect what he said, because every single thing he wrote was politically incorrect. So, just how you could tell he was a thinker, by the way. He talked about the unholy alliance between hyper-dependent children and their mothers. He said, well, it's actually, because Freud thought about it as a maternal thing. I'm not putting Freud down, because Freud mapped out the Oedipal situation brilliantly. I'm not putting Freud down. But, you know, Jung was taking ideas and expanding them outward. You know, he said that there was actually an unholy alliance between a hyper-dependent child and an Oedipal over-dependent mother. And the alliance was, the mother would always offer. So maybe the kid is supposed to go off and do something that would require a little bit of courage and effort. And the mother says, are you sure you're feeling well enough to do it? And then the child would say, yes. Or the child would say no, and then, you know, it's dead. The thing is, the child made the damn decision too. And you might think, well, that's pretty harsh, but just because children are little doesn't mean they're stupid. And you don't know children if you don't know how children know how to manipulate. Because they are staggeringly good at that. Because they're studying you non-stop, trying to figure out, A, what you're up to, and B, how they can get what they want in the way that they want it. So they can play a manipulative game, no problem, especially if they're well schooled in it. And so it's sort of like that. It's like maybe the mother is a little timid and a little inclined to overprotect, and maybe the child is a little manipulative and a little willing to not take that courageous step out in the world and to regress into infantile dependency instead. And then you get a terrible dynamic building across time that is like a vicious circle, you know, or like a positive feedback loop. It just expands and expands and expands. Because sometimes in families you see a hyper-dependent child and a perfectly independent child, and same mother. So obviously, same mother. I mean, mothers are very complex, and mother for child A and mother for child B are not the same mother, even if they happen to be the same human being. The literature is quite clear on that. But you get my point. But God's idea was, not only are you not doing well because you're not doing well, but you're not doing well because you've actually really spent a lot of work figuring out how to not do well. This is like creative effort on your part. And if you read about truly malevolent people, and you could start with the Columbine killers because they left some very interesting diaries behind. So I would recommend them. There's plenty of serial killers you could read about, and the people who've really gone out and done dark things, and I've read more than my fair share of that sort of thing and understand it quite well. If you really want to have your countenance fall and be wroth, 10 years of brooding on your own catastrophe, sort of alone, and letting your fantasies take shape, and egging them on, and allowing them to flourish and, let's say, take possession of you, because that's exactly the right way to think about it. That'll get you somewhere like this. And there are more people who are like that than you think, and you're more like that than you think. Well, so Cain is obviously not very happy about this whole answer, obviously, because the last thing you want to hear if your life is turned into a catastrophe and you take God to task for creating a universe where that sort of thing was allowed, is that it's your own damn fault, and you should straighten up and fly right, so to speak, and you shouldn't be complaining about the nature of being. That is the answer he gets. And so then what happens? Well, we have to infer that if Cain was angry before, that he's a lot more angry now. And of course, that's exactly what the story reveals. And Cain talked with Abel, his brother. And it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and slew him. And he needed something else. This is foreshadowing again. This is from the same chapter, by the way. Do what is meaningful, not what is expedient. Jesus was led into the wilderness, according to the story, to be tempted by the devil. Matthew 4:1, prior to his crucifixion. This is the story of Cain, restated abstractly. Cain is far from happy, as we have seen. He's working hard, or so he thinks, but God is not pleased. Meanwhile, Abel is dancing away in the daisies. His crops flourish, women love him. Worst of all, he's a pretty good guy. Everyone knows it. He deserves his good fortune. All the more reason to hate him. I used to joke when I used to teach at Harvard, and now and then my wife would have some of the undergraduates over. We used to joke afterwards, because some of them many of them were very remarkable kids, you know, like they were super smart, they were athletic, they had some dramatic ability, or they were musicians, or they'd done some spectacular charitable work. Because basically, to get accepted into Harvard, you had to be top of your damn school, and then you had to have at least 2 other outstanding things going for you, you know. And what was so annoying about most of these kids, this was our joke, was you really both liked them and respected them. It's like, my joke was, you'd think they would have had the good graces to be like dislikable sons of bitches, at least with all those other great things going for them. They had to add like respectability and likability to it as well. So you thought, well, you know, it really couldn't happen to a better person. It's like, good God. Well, that's Abel's situation, you know. It's like, and you know, the funny thing too is that that's an ideal. That's the ideal, right? An ideal person, you would say, would be someone who you would want to be like, and someone who is operating in the world like you would want to operate, and someone who fortune was smiling on, and someone who's making the right sacrifices. It's really what you would want to be. And so Cain kills that. Right, so it's a psychological story too. And you see this in the cynicism that people have about people who have done well in the world. They're always looking for some reason why they've done well. They must be crooked, or they must be conniving, or they must be arrogant, or they must be psychopathic, or and of course all of those things exist. But it's a very bad trick to play on yourself to make the proposition that the person in the world who represents your own ideal is that ideal because of despicable reasons. Because what you do is train yourself that the ideal that you should pursue can only exist if it's motivated by despicable reasons. And then what? Not only is Abel, your brother, dead as your brother in the field, in reality, but you've also slaughtered your own ideal. Well, then what the hell are you going to work for? Well, how are you going to live then? Well, bitterly and miserably, that's for sure. Bitterly, miserably, and hopelessly. That's how you're going to live. You know, and it's so rare that I see, especially publicly, that people honestly admit. With sports figures, they'll do it. That's one place that seems to happen. But it's so uncommon for expressions of admiration and gratitude to manifest themselves in any public communication of any sort. Newspapers, TV, YouTube, Twitter. It's almost always undermining and backbiting and criticism, and very often directed to people who
I'm gonna detonate this one remotely.
Who have often done little else but bring good things into the world for other people. And that's part of why this is such a profound story. He's a pretty good guy, everyone knows it. He deserves his good fortune. All the more reason to hate him, that's for sure. Cain broods on his misfortune like a vulture on an egg. He enters the desert wilderness of his own mind. He obsesses over his ill fortune and betrayal. He nourishes his resentment. He indulges in ever more elaborate fantasies of revenge. His arrogance grows to Luciferian proportions. I'm ill-used and oppressed, he thinks. This is a stupid, bloody planet. It can go to hell. And with that, he encounters Satan in the wilderness. Falls prey to his temptation. He does what he can in John Milton's unforgettable ways to confound the race of mankind in the first root and mingle and involve earth with hell. Done all to spite the great Creator. He turns to evil to obtain what good forbade him, and he does it voluntarily, self-consciously, and with malice. Let him who has ears hear.
I'm fast as fuck, boy. Still fast
So
as
that's
fuck,
the
boy.
first two you
Come get some.
The resentful, bitter failure taking an axe to the admirable success. Then the Lord said unto Cain, Where is Abel thy brother? And he said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. Now art thou cursed from the earth, which hath opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. You know, if you want to understand that, which I would recommend, you could read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. That's a great novel. I think it might be the greatest novel ever written, because I haven't read every novel. But in my experience, it's the greatest novel. And it is exactly this. It says what happens psychologically if you commit the ultimate crime. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. There's no psychologist like Dostoevsky. Who now tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth. And Cain said unto the Lord, Now, one of the things that's interesting about this is that, I think the punishment that God lays on Cain it's like the inevitable consequences of Cain's action. It's something like that. It's like, well, he killed his brother. there's no going back from that, man. Like, good luck forgiving yourself for that. Especially if he was an ideal, especially if he was your ideal, because you haven't just killed your brother and, of course, tortured your parents and the rest of your family. You've deprived the community of someone who's upstanding, and you did it for the worst possible motivations. It's like, there's no up from there, right? That's as close to hell as you can manage on earth. And Cain said unto him, behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid. That too. It's like there's also no turning back to God, let's say, after an error like that, because, well, you've done everything you possibly could to spite God, assuming he exists, and the probability that you're going to be able to mend that relationship in your now broken state, when you couldn't mend it to begin with before you did something so terrible, starts to move towards zero. And it shall come to pass that everyone that findeth me shall slay me. And the Lord said unto him, therefore, whosoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. That's an interesting thing. I wondered about that for a long time, because you might think, well, why did God take Cain under his wing, so to speak, given what's already happened? And I think it has something to do with the emergence of the idea that it was necessary to prevent tit-for-tat revenge slayings, and something like that. And there's hints of that later in the text, because, it's like, well, I kill your brother, and then you kill two of my brothers, and then I kill your whole family, and then you kill my whole town, and then I kill your whole country, and then we blow up the world. It's like, that's probably not a very intelligent solution to the initial problem, even though the initial problem, which was murder, is not an easy thing to solve. But I think it's something like that. And then the last part of the story is, that's William Blake. So Adam and Eve discovered their dead son. Cain has become cognizant, I would say, of what he did and what he is. Right, so it's another entrance into a form of self-consciousness. It's the self-consciousness that Adam and Eve developed was painful enough. They become aware of their own vulnerability and their nakedness, and perhaps even their capacity for evil. But Cain becomes aware of his voluntary engagement with evil itself, and sees that as a crucial human capability. And that's something modern people, it's no wonder we don't take it seriously. Like I know in the academy and among intellectual circles for decades, the idea of evil has been, it's like, what are you, medieval or something? The whole idea of evil, that's a non-starter as an intellectual starting place, as a topic. And that's something that I'm just unable to understand, because I cannot understand how you can possibly have more than a cursory knowledge of history of the 20th century, much less a deep knowledge of the history of the 20th century, and to walk away with any other conclusion than, well, good might not exist, but evil, hey! The evidence for that is so overwhelming that only willful blindness could possibly explain denying in its existence. And that was actually a useful discovery for me, because I also concluded, perhaps, that if it was true evil existed, then it was true by inference that its opposite existed. Because the opposite of evil, let's say the evil of the concentration camp, let's say, or we could get more specific about it, we could say there's this one thing that used to happen in Auschwitz, where they would take people off the incoming trains, those who lived, that weren't stacked around the outside of the train cars, and froze to death because it was too cold. Those who only had to be stuck in the middle where it was warm enough so that maybe the old people died because they suffocated, but at least some of them were alive when they made it to Auschwitz, and then they took those poor people out. One of the tricks that the guards used to play on them was to have the newly arrived prisoners hoist like 100-pound sacks of wet salt and carry them from one side of the compound. And these compounds were big. This was a city. It wasn't like a gymnasium. It was like a city. There were tens of thousands of people there. They'd have them carry the sack of wet salt from one side of the compound to the other and then back. Right? And that was to make a mockery out of the notion that work would set you free. It's like, no,
I'm
you
fast
work
as
here,
fuck, boy.
but there's nothing productive about it.
Still fast as fuck, boy.
The whole point is
Come
exactly
get
the
some.
opposite of sacrifice in some sense. And so we're going to make you act out working, but all it will do is speed your demise. And maybe we can decorate it up a little bit, because not only will it speed up your demise, it will do it in a very painful way, while simultaneously increasing the probability that other people's demises will be painful and sped up. It's a work of art, that's for sure. And to know about that sort of thing and to not regard it as evil means, well, you can figure out what it means for yourself. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived. You know, and one of the criticisms, a fairly common criticism of these biblical stories is, well, if Cain and Abel were the only two people, and from Adam and Eve, it's like, where did all these other people come from? And doesn't that make the story like simple-minded? It's like, no, that makes the reader simple-minded. You know, I mean, really, that's the best criticism of this you're going to come up with? I mean, you might say, you missed the point. That would be the right response. You missed the point. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch, and he builded a city. And so it's Cain that builds the cities and starts the civilization. That's pretty rough too, right? So it's the first fratricide murderer who builds the cities. After the name of his son Enoch, unto Enoch was born Irad, etc., etc., going through the generations. And Lamech took unto him two wives. The name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other Zillah. This is an attempt to flesh out the genealogy and to describe how culture started in some sense, in tribal communities. And Ada bare Jabal, and he was the father of such as dwell in tents, and of such as have cattle. And his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all as such handle the harp and organ. And Zillah, she also bare Tubal-Cain, and instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. And Tubal-Cain, traditionally, is the first person who makes weapons of war. And Lamech, descendant of, said unto his wives Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech, hearken unto my speech. For I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. If Cain be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold. Well, what I see in that is this proclivity of this murderous capacity of Cain as it manifests itself as society develops to a murderous intent that transcends the mere killing of a brother. You hurt me, I hurt you back. No, you hurt me, I kill you with 6 other people. And the thing that happens after that is to not make it 7 people, but to make it 70 people. And so there's this idea that once that first murderous seed is sown, it has this proclivity to manifest itself exponentially. And that's a warning, and that's also why I think Tubal-Cain, who was one of Cain's descendants, was the first person who made weapons of war. And that's pretty much the story of Cain and Abel. And it's a hell of a story, as far as I can tell. And I think it's worth thinking about pretty much forever, because there's so many, it has so many facets, you know. And I think the most usefully revealing of those facets is the potential for the story, once understood, to shed light on not your own failure, not even on your rejection by being, let's say, but on the proclivity to murder the best and the best in you for revenge upon that violation. Because what that means, and we know that knowledge of good and evil entered the world, so to speak, with Adam and Eve's transgression, is that now not only does humanity have to contend with tragedy and suffering, and even the unharvested fruits of proper sacrifice, but with the introduction of real malevolence into the world. So there's the fall into history, and then there's the discovery of sacrifice as a medication for the fall, and then there's a counterposition, which is the emergence of malevolence as the enemy of proper sacrifice. And that's where we're left at the end of Cain and Abel. And that's the end of that lecture. Thank you. All right.
Okay. So you've said that one of your moral axioms is that pain is bad. So we should work to eliminate unnecessary suffering. Isn't this the basis for a secular morality like utilitarianism? And can we therefore be moral without religion?
Well, I don't think that it's, first of all, probably, to the first question, but that's also, that derivation is predicated on the idea that that's the only idea, that I'm putting forward as an ethical idea, and it's not. If that was the only idea, well, then you could derive from that a fairly straightforward branch of utilitarianism. But it also, I think, to push the argument in that direction also necessitates the reduction of what might constitute pain to something too unidimensional, because I think suffering is a better term than pain, although pain in some sense is at the core of suffering. Suffering is a multi-dimensional phenomena, and I don't think that you can draw a simple utilitarian argument that either the existence of suffering or the observation that it's the reduction of unnecessary suffering might be a good thing. So I'm also leery of those. See, it's not reasonable in some sense to reduce a complex set of ideas to a single proposition, and then say the ideas that I've been putting forward, and then to reduce another complex philosophical set of ideas to a single proposition, and then say, aren't those two things the same? And they are once you reduce them to the two simple axioms, or you could argue that they're the same, but I would say there's a tremendous amount left out in the telling, and that what's left out is relevant. It kind of reminds me of those philosophical games that psychologists often play. It's like, well, if there was, I don't know if I can call this properly. The trolley cart problem. Something like, if there was a train that was out of control and was going towards 6 people on one track, would you flip a switch so it switched tracks and only killed one person? Would you do that? And I read a question like that and think, that's a stupid question. And the reason I think that is because you can't take a situation like that and render it properly by reducing it to that question. And then you also can't assume that the person who answers that question would in fact act in the way they answer. You can't presume any of that. It's like, because in a situation like that, a high stress situation like that, the devil is in the details. And I've dealt with situations like that a number of times and know perfectly well that the devil's in the details. So I think that there's an intellectual reduction to make a philosophical point that doesn't give the complexity of the topic justice. And then there was a second part to that, which was, and therefore can't we be moral without religion? Well, I would say that question also suffers in some sense from the same problem of formulation. I'm very hesitant ever to answer a question of the form, is A merely a manifestation of B, when A and B are very complex things? Because the answer to that is, it depends on what you mean by moral and what you mean by religious. Because, see, there's an underlying intellectual maneuver in a question like that. And the underlying maneuver is the a priori assumption that something as complex as religion or as complex as morality can be reduced to an object with a name, and that then two objects reduced to their name can be assessed simultaneously. And I don't think that that's the case. I think you can say something like, is a triangle a square? I think you can say that. But I don't think you can say, is it possible to have morality without religion? I don't think you can have that question. It has to be expanded out. It's like, what do you mean by morality? What do you mean by religion? Because maybe and maybe not. And so the answer to that question is to decompose the question.
I wonder if, in spite of your idea that kids need to become tough and learn to slay dragons, if you have anything good to say about the idea of homeschooling.
Well, I don't have anything bad to say about it. I do know that the Quebec government has recently taken moves to make it much more difficult for people to homeschool their children. And it's not like 5 years, 15 years ago, I would have presumed that the vast majority of people who were homeschooling their children were to be viewed with skepticism initially. I'm not so sure about that anymore. For example, I was sent a poster today. Someone sent me this link that they found in a local junior high school, and one of the media pieces that were recommended on this poster was a movie called Hedwig and the Angry Inch. Now, I thought that was a terrible movie, even though I'm perfectly capable of enjoying bizarre movies. But so it's a bizarre movie, that's for sure, but I also thought it was a terrible, bitter movie. Terrible and bitter. Those are separate. A movie can be bitter and be quite great, but it was a terrible movie and it was a bitter movie. But I can tell you one bloody thing about that movie. It's not required viewing for 12-year-old kids. That's for sure. So I think you have increasing reason to be skeptical of the public education system. I also looked at the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario's guidelines for education from kindergarten to grade 8, and what that is in essence, and I think I'll do a video about it in the relatively near future, is a blueprint for transforming children into social justice warriors. It basically says that. It's like you don't have to be a conspiracy theory to read that. I mean, we have social justice tribunals in Ontario. And so the idea is, well, if you're going to get your children, if you're going to get people to, what would you say, favor equity properly, well, then you better start teaching them while they're young. It's like, maybe not. So now, you ask that question properly, because you say, well, the terrible education system, the wonderful mother homeschooling, right? That's the danger. It's like, no, because it might not be the wonderful mother homeschooling. It might be the pathological mother using the pathology of the education system as an excuse to get her talons into her children, right? Because that's certainly equally possible, or perhaps even more possible, because at least in the public education system, there's some necessity for consensus. So that's something to be very aware of and work to prevent, right? And so I would say if you're going to do that, probably best not to do it on your own. It's like you need a board of advisors or something like that, and so maybe it can't just be you, and you have to figure out, well, what is the aim? And how are you going to manage that? What makes you think you can do it? Even if it's being done badly publicly, what makes you think you could do it better? I mean, my general advice is, and people have asked me this, in fact I had a conversation with a guy who was tiling my backyard this morning about something his son had said to him that he was taught at school recently, which really made the tiler who had come from another authoritarian country step back on his heels and think, I'm not so sure I should be sending my kid to public school anymore. Maybe I shouldn't be living in Toronto even. You know, but my general advice is keep an eye on your kids and discuss with them what they're learning and help equip them with the tools to not only to articulate their own viewpoint in response to what they're being taught. Now, the problem is you might not have the time nor the ability to do that. That's no simple thing. And increasingly, if you're unwilling
Fast
to
as fuck, boy.
have your children
Still fast as fuck, boy.
what is
Come get some.
increasingly indoctrination and not education, thanks to, in no small part, to the Ontario Institute of Studies on Education, which is an institution that I particularly despise, because I think that almost all it does now is produce indoctrinators of children. It's not an easy problem to solve. So more power to you wanting to put your children in a situation where they're not being indoctrinated. But the alternative is very, very complicated and difficult. Likely, you know, I would say, generally speaking, there's a shamanic basis to almost all the religious traditions, because that's the milieu out of which the religious traditions emerge. I can't say much more than that because I don't know, and no one does, the particularities. You might say, well, is there an allusion to the ingestion of psychoactive chemicals in the Adam and Eve story? And people have made that case. The powerful cases for these in this book, for example, I think it's called Soma by Diane Gordon Lasson, who was the first person, amateur mycologist, who was the first person who proposed that the soma of the Hindus were at Amanita muscaria mushrooms, which is actually those are the red mushrooms with the white dots that you always see in fairy tales, you know, the cute ones. Toadstools. Flies like these, and they're called flies. Also, flies seem to like getting stoned. I know that's weird. I know that's a weird thing to say. But I have a good book on animal use of psychedelics. More animal use than you might think. But anyways, there is some evidence that of use of the ingestion of fruits, let's say, metaphorically speaking, as an aid to the transformation of consciousness that goes back so far, well, forever as far as human beings are concerned. But to specifically tie that to the Adam and Eve story, I haven't really seen any evidence that definitively linked it. There's been a lot of interesting books written. There's one that was quite a weird hit, I think in the late 60s, might have been early 70s. It sort of got brushed off as a hippie book, but it really wasn't. It's called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. That's the sort of book you read, you think, huh, I don't know what to do about that. I have no idea what to do about that. So, that's all I can say about that. Yeah.
My question's about martyrdom. So, what do you think martyrdom, or the willingness to suffer and die for what you believe, if anything, says of convictions? And what do you think is the benefit of the martyr, which is
I'll
at
show you
least
guys-
traditionally an immaterial and transcendent good compared to the regular sacrifice or practical sacrifice, which is ordered to the future material, psychological, or economic good.
Man, you guys really come with some wicked questions.
Move over, buddy.
I think it depends to some degree on how you define martyrdom. Because you could define it as the tendency to pathologically self-aggrandise yourself on public display. Or you could say it's the decision to be immovable about a certain principle. So let's go with that one. Forget about the first one. Well, I wouldn't recommend it. And in some sense, it's people ask me, I'll make it personal, people ask me when I first got involved with this political person they asked me a couple of things. They asked me if this was the hill that I would really choose to die on, pronouns and the transgender issue. Yeah, well, it's not what I want to hit, but I mean, it was about language. That makes it non-trivial. Bill C-16 was passed this week. One of the things that was quite interesting was that Brenda Costa, who was the woman that I debated, I think it's one of the persons that I debated, like to be referred to as Brenda. Anyways, she wrote an op-ed, and I believe it was in the Globe and Mail, but it might have been the National Post, saying, as I knew she would say, that Bill C-16 was just the beginning. Kind of like work left to do. Anyways, I was asked during that period of time whether or not I was being a martyr. And I thought, well, it's really one of my ambitions, you know. So that's sort of a torn to the lines thing. Doesn't sound like exactly something you might do. But I think, well, sometimes you find out in your life, maybe, that there's something you won't do. And one thing, and then maybe you just don't do it, no matter what the consequences. Maybe, I don't know, because I haven't been pushed to that point, but there have been people who have been pushed to that point in history, and they basically said, I don't care what you do to me, I'm not doing that. And maybe some of them were suicidal, and some of them were psychotic, and some of them had whatever other problems that people might have. But yeah, I do have this suspicion now and then that some of them are just kind of serious about saying no. And there's some utility in being serious about saying no. And that sort of revealed itself to me, I suppose, to some degree, back in September, when I read a piece of legislation that said I would have to use some words that were legislated by the government. And I thought, there's no goddamn way I'm going to do that under any conditions that I can imagine. Now, there are conditions, and I have a pretty good imagination for unimaginable conditions. I couldn't see it because I thought that if I did that, I would break. Whatever would be left of me after having done that would no longer be me, and I'm not interested in that. I know what that would be like. I actually do know what that would be like, and I'm not interested in that. I would rather have whatever else happens, happen. And people have said to me, well, you're so courageous for taking this stand. It's like, yeah, well, I'm not going to claim any sort of world courage, I can tell you that. But but one thing I do know the difference between is different forms of hell. Let's put it that way. And there's the hell that maybe I might be dragged through if I don't act in accordance with this law, and there's the hell that I would be dragged through if I did act in accordance with the law, and I would vastly prefer the first hell to the second, and isn't clear to me that that actually constitutes courage. Is it useful? Because that's also the question about martyrdom. I think it's very useful for people to see that someone will say, there's no way, there's no conceivable way that you can get me to do that. And I've thought long and hard about such things too, because I've taught very many people to negotiate. And one of the things I always teach them is you don't negotiate from a position of weakness, because you lose. And so if I say no to something, and I mean no, I mean no. I bloody well won't do it. And I think that if there are people who also agree that such things aren't appropriate, to have the example of someone who says no and means it actually turns out to be useful. And so then I would say, well, that's an inclination in the potential direction of martyrdom. And but I don't see how to distinguish that from actually just having the courage of your convictions. And so sometimes you might say, well, a person who has sufficient courage in their convictions will sometimes be put to death. Well, if that's the definition of a martyr, then sometimes, but not always, that's a really good thing. And one of the things I really liked about Solzhenitsyn's book, The Gulag Archipelago, which is I refer to it often, is an absolutely staggering book, is that he put in many, many stories of people who were in the Gulag, and they were often religious believers, which was a shock to him because he was an atheistic communist when he first entered the camps. They were often religious believers, and they were people who said no. There were things they would not do. They would not participate in what the regime was asking them to do. And he would have to read it because the stories. Solzhenitsyn in the camp grew to have tremendous admiration and actually viewed them as exemplars of the mode of being that was necessary for him to escape both the communist propaganda that had shaped him as an individual and also the terrible bitterness and sorrow and anger that he experienced as a consequence of being flung into the terrible concentration camp conditions of the Gulag Archipelago. So, yeah.
Hey Doc, thanks for staying alive and potentially saving humanity. Yeah, that's good stuff. Wondering about a couple things. Firstly, who won that childhood fight? You kind of let that just slide, so I'm thinking it was a big L.
Well, I can tell you because he was a tough little kid. See, I don't remember what happened, but my remembrance of him was that he could pound me out pretty effectively. So, his name was Vernon Switchman. Yeah, he was a good friend of mine, and I think Vernon still lives in Fairview. So if he hears of this, then maybe he'll remember that too. And so probably he would have won. I didn't win that many physical fights when I was a kid. So
That's not the only question.
Okay.
Anyway, cool. I'm not sure if you've actually been asked this before. I missed the last few lectures, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are on Tolkien, J.R. Tolkien, and his work, not just Lord of the Rings, but the Silmarillion, which is basically like I'm seeing all this, and I'm thinking it's like the modern Bible in a way. It's got the weird names like Tubal Cain and all that stuff, and specifically when we were talking about Cain just now, and how he was when he was talking about how he felt like betrayed by God, and he spent his whole life working to spite him essentially, and he kind of set the path forward for the darkness in humanity. That's almost exactly Melkor, which was in the Silmarillion, and basically what spawned everything evil in Middle Earth and Mordor and whatnot. And I don't even know as much as some people go on.
Tolkien, a student of mythology, and, the story of the Hobbit is a retelling of Beowulf in Isengard, and that's a dragon slaying myth, and so the reason that Tolkien and Rowling, for that matter, are so popular is because they've done a very good job of making the old myths new. And well, look what's happened with Marvel series. It's the same thing. With Star Wars, the other thing is that you can't not respond to these stories. Now, you're going to find them in one form or another, and sometimes, well, with the biblical stories, for example, the meaning of the mythological content has become invisible. That's partly the death of God that we've been referring to. But that doesn't mean that the stories themselves vanish because people have an eternal hunger for it. Now, the problem with them emerging in, let's say, more literary or less sophisticated form, let's take the movies as an example, is that they're not surrounded by an articulated culture, the same as biblical stories. So, for example, they're not surrounded by something like Paradise Lost, John Milton, or John Milton, which are works of unlimited depth. And so you throw away something of great value, reacquire it in a given place with less value, perhaps with more comprehensibility. It's not a great trade. That is not a critique of Tolkien. It's not a critique of anybody who's drawing on mythological stories for their narrative. You have to do that to be a good storyteller. It's nice to go to the sources as well. Yeah. And the overlaps that you described, well, yeah, it's exactly what you'd expect. To deal with great mythological themes.
Fast as fuck, boy.
The archetypes are at the bottom.
Still fast
of
as fuck,
stories.
boy.
So
Come get some.
if the story goes down far enough, it runs into the archetypes. And well, that was Jung's claim, and I think he got that exactly right. So, yep. Last one.
There's a passage in Paradise Lost where the demons are building pandemonium under Mammon's sort of guidance. They crack open it's not really Earth, but hell, and they take out the gold and build pandemonium, which is the most sophisticated architectural wonder of all time in Milton's language. And this conception of taking material and turning it into a temple to oneself was interpreted by Humphrey Jennings, who was the founder of the mass observation movement. If anyone saw the opening to the Britain's 2012 games, the history of the Industrial Revolution, he said, was encapsulated by this passage. If I can't shoot it, someone else. Demons building a temple for themselves out of matter. And mankind, in Milton's language, was taught to do this. They learned it first by this example. It says, let not envy the devils have riches in hell. And I see things in this one, the Gnostic idea that somehow the world itself that we inhabit is hell, and that matter is not our true existence, but sometimes platonic. And also the Faustian sort of bargain made around 1600 so we can go home. To get a world of stuff being by losing the soul. No time to what existed before that, and I wonder if that I play with that a lot in my own thought. Go! Think about that.
Well, Milton was definitely a prophetic voice, right? And I think that's a perfectly reasonable retelling of that section. It's also very much akin to the story of the Tower of Babel, which we'll talk about next week.
On with the wind. Keep moving.
See, the problem, God, it's so complicated. See, one of the things that Jung said about the transformation of the first millennium of Christianity into, let's say, the second millennium of Christianity was that Christianity had promised something like redemption.
Fast as fuck, boy.
Redemption from suffering.
Still fast as fuck,
Maybe
boy. Come get some.
Let's say, because it didn't really solve the problem of suffering here and now. And Jung believed that as people had, although it did many positive things. Let's not forget that. It civilized people in a way that they hadn't been before. You can make that case. Then there's this underground. At the same time, there's this denial of the utility of material reality that went along with the spiritualization of mankind in the Christian life. There was value left in material because it had been ignored. And so then Jung believed that the collective unconscious, broadly speaking, began to be attracted to what had been rejected by the hyper-spiritualization and started to question whether or not additional value could be extracted from the material, maybe as an adjunct to the spiritual, because maybe true redemption was something like a proper meeting of the spiritual and the material, which wasn't something that seemed to be part and parcel of Christian doctrine up to that point. Now, maybe what Milton was warning against was a swing too far, right? And I think Milton's point is well taken, because one of the things that's worth noting is that you can be perfectly miserable in a house of gold, right? I mean, I've known very many wealthy people, very, very wealthy people. And the problem, see, the thing is that money just doesn't solve that many problems. That people wish it would. People who want to be rich think it will, and the people who want to redistribute money think it will. And I know that there's nothing to be said for abject poverty, but the problem is that there are many serious problems that human beings have that material comfort alone does nothing to address, or almost nothing. You can be have a perfectly miserable family life and $20 million. And the buffer that the $20 million puts between you and the misery sometimes it's not even a buffer, it's a magnifier. So, Milton was warned against the creation of even the idea of a material utopia, even in principle, something Dostoevsky also recognized this. You cannot solve the problem in that manner. Maybe the demonic idea is propaganda that you could. Now maybe there is a balance of something, I don't understand. We were going to build the city of God, let's say. Well, a huge part of the endeavor would have to be spiritual. To me, a huge part of that would be, it would have to be something predicated, if not on truth, at least on the willingness of people not to lie to one another. Without that, all the material well-being in the world is a thought. It's like gilding a corpse. And I think that's partly what Milton was warning against. I mean, Milton was doing many more things than he knew, of course, because he was a poetic genius of incalculable genius. Right. Well, you've obviously thought of it.
I'm fast as fuck, boy. Still fast as fuck, boy.
All right, everyone.
Come get
Good
some.
night. So I'm going to launch right into it. I like this story as well. This is the story of Noah and the flood, and then the Tower of Babel, which I think are juxtaposed very interestingly. The Tower of Babel is one of those stories like Cain and Abel that's only a few lines long. It's like a fragment in some sense, although the story of Noah is quite a well-developed narrative. But like the other stories that we've covered, it is relevant at multiple levels of analysis simultaneously. And so what I'm going to do to begin with is to start with some background information, so some psychological background information so that the story makes sense. And the first thing that I'd like to make a case for is that you bring to bear on the world an a priori perceptual structure. And that's really an embodied structure, and it's a consequence of the 3.5 billion years that you've spent putting your body together, which is a tremendous amount of time. And not only your body, but your mind, of course, because your mind is part of your body and very much embedded within it. You know, you tend to think that you have your brain in your head and it's sort of floating separate from the rest of your body, but it's not really true. You're a tremendous, massive system of neurons running through your entire body, autonomic. There's more neurons in the autonomic nervous system than there are in the central nervous system, so that's a lot of neurons. And then your central nervous system, of course, enables you to exercise voluntary control over your musculature and also to receive information from it. Your brain is really distributed through your body. One of the things you may not know is that people who are paraplegic can walk if you suspend them above a treadmill. Their legs will walk by themselves with no voluntary control. So your spine is capable of quite complex activity. In fact, when you walk, mostly it's a controlled fall, and mostly your spine is doing it. And so anyways, the point of all that is that You don't have a blank slate consciousness that's interpreting a world that manifests itself as segregated objects in some straightforward sense. You have a built-in interpretive system that's extraordinarily deeply embedded and invisible, because you might think about it as the implicit structure of your unconscious. It's what gives rise to your conscious experience, and it presents you with the world. That's one way of thinking about it, and it's a good way of thinking about it. It's the psychoanalytic way of thinking about it, as well as the neuroscientific way of thinking about it, because one of the things that's pretty interesting about modern neuroscientists, especially the top-rate ones, and those are usually the ones that are working on emotions, as far as I've been able to tell, are often quite enamored of the psychoanalyst. Jak II is a good example of that, because they came to understand that the psychoanalyst's insistence on underlying unconscious personified motivations was actually an active reflection of how the brain worked. So to think of yourself as a loose collection of autonomous spirits that's governed by some overarching identity is a reasonable way of thinking about it. The question is, or a question that arises from that is, what is the nature of this a priori structure that you use to interpret the world? And I think the clearest answer to that is that it's a story, that you live inside a story. And that's very, very interesting to me, because I believe, I have a couple of videos that lay this out. I believe that Darwinian presuppositions
It is finished. Our ancient enemy is no more. Take hope, brave one. The terrible darkness inside you is now balanced by a glorious light. We will meet again.
We haven't much time. I've set the coordinates back to our village. Let's go home, everyone.
But we are home.
Kira, I'm afraid your Rift Rider must be used to send young Jak here to a place where he will grow up, safe from harm. He must become old enough to complete the destiny he has fulfilled today. Wait a minute. It's you. I mean, it's me. I have to take him back and watch over him, don't I? Ah, grub roots. Talk about being in the wrong time at the right place.
Hey kid, you take care. Oh, and trust me on this. Stay away from any Wumpy nest on your 9th birthday, okay?
I sure hope I built this replica right. I don't know if it...
It's perfect, Kira. This is the very machine we found, or will find later.
What? I just built this. After seeing the first one, I mean. It's based on what I remember from before.
Honey, the more you think about it, the more it hurts the head.
I'll take good care of the child. And don't worry. I'll be back in time for the celebration. Farewell.
Thanks, Amos. Without you...
It's funny. The boy won't remember any of this.
No. I do remember the light.
Your transport is ready, milady.
Thank you, Captain Bruder. Come on. We'll be late for the party at Daxter's new place.
I've got so much work to do. Besides, it's not my thing.